Hi, I'm Darren Bradley, contributing photographer to the book American Icons, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today, it's our newest Children of Genius show.
Genius.
With guest Jim Venturi, son of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, Peter Nowicki, son of Matthew and Siasia Nowicki, and Sue Ann Kahn, daughter of Lou Kahn. And now here's your host, son of architect George Smart, Mr. Modernism, George Smart, Jr.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Over the last 10 years of U.S. Modernist Radio, Children of Genius has been one of our most popular themes. We've been honored to interview the sons, daughters, grandsons, and granddaughters of the architects whose houses we love. We've talked with the children of Craig Elwood, Ed Dart, Edward Durrell Stone, Edward Larrabee Barnes, Landis Goris, Elliot Noyes, Eero Saarinen, Richard Neutra, Marcel Breuer, Norman Jaffe, Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles and Ray Eames, Bill Cody, and it just goes on and on. And while most architects' children do not become architects, modernism is always in their DNA. Like me. My architect dad was never famous. He was rarely published, and when it was only in local publications. Like 95% of architectural practices in America, my dad was a journeyman architect, working on schools and churches and other buildings we all need, but that don't track a rise to fame. He did create a special genetic gift, though, one that he would laugh about and perhaps be proud about today. I was notoriously uninterested in architecture his entire life, even after working in his office a few summers, running off blueprints on a huge Bruning machine leaking ammonia. Ventilation? Oh, please. I had to beg him to put in a fan, and that just moved the ammonia around.
Gee, thanks, Dad.
When he died in 2003, that intense disinterest continued until one dark and stormy night in January of 2007, when the architecture in my DNA switched on, kind of like that alien popping out of the guy in the movie. But that's a story for another day. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Los Angeles, Malibu, Toronto, and Palm Springs.
Filmmaker, teacher, and urban planner Jim Venturi is the founder of Rethink Studio and Rethink NYC. He's also the son of architectural legends Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, famous for Learning from Las Vegas, a thought-provoking critique of modernism. Jim spent 20 years working on the new documentary Stardust, the story of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, celebrating his parents' remarkable decades of partnership. George spoke with Jim in New York during the film's premiere at the Architecture and Design Film Festival.
I'm looking at a very young photo of Jim Venturi from Architectural Record, where in 2008 he announces that he is going to make a film about his parents, and he expects that it will be released in 2009. But as we all know, things happen, and these take a lot of time. So tell me about your journey making this film happen, Jim.
Well, let's see. I started in 2004, and my goal was to capture my parents while they were still alive and relatively spry, and I wanted to be able to make a film that would be able to be viewable by future generations who could read their books, see their architecture, hopefully, in person, and as well as photos, and learn about them and apply it to their own time and apply their thinking. So I'm grateful to be able to have done that and create something that allows people to understand their intention about who they are and their intention to produce work that is for the overall good. And I was also heartened by the fact that many had learned from their theories, their books, and their architecture and applied it in fields outside of architecture. And there were a lot of people who were not architects who were really, taken with the work. And that was very exciting to me because of the fact that I wasn't in architecture, wasn't of interest to me. And so being able to create a film of that. However, I soon learned that that doesn't make a good story. And so I started filming in 2004. We finished filming in 2010, the last bits. And I struggled to find an editor that wanted to take it on. And then eventually I found a writer who then worked as an editor who hadn't done documentary film before. And she crafted, I think, what we call an intimate portrait of Bob and Denise, where people to get to know them, and many people see it as a love story, and that's really heartening and warm.
Yes.
And the film, we've been told, has many layers, which I would agree with, but I'm also biased towards it. So there's lots of different things to see each time you see it.
One of the words that I've heard used a lot about your parents is misunderstood. So what are the main things that were misunderstood about them?
There's a quote from Einstein that was popularized by the organizational behaviorist academic and general around Mensch, Russell Ackoff. Without changing our present patterns of thought, we can't solve the problems that were created with those patterns of thought. And I think that people easily can be in a pattern of thought, and my parents in a different pattern of thought. And therefore, when you apply the previous pattern of thought to things that are different, you're going to misunderstand them because you don't understand the intention, because your patterns of thought are different.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm being obtuse, I don't mean to be, but I think that generically is the root of various forms of misunderstanding. I mean, I could give you a laundry list of misunderstandings, but the consequence of that is about intention, is about what Campbell talks about, the concretization of myth, the idea of taking an idea, what Steve Jobs called the results of other people's thoughts, that is already there, and copying it, but putting it into a different situation that doesn't apply to that thinking. And I think what a master does is that they have fresh ideas that learn from previous generations but apply them in a fresh way. And I think that's what makes it magical. I think if you try to copy the ideas and put them in a different context, they're going to fall flat if you copy the literal result of the thinking and apply it differently.
So in other words, is this a paradigm shift?
I think that's overused, paradigm shift. But yeah, that is what is trying to be made by paradigm shift. Absolutely. I mean, I love Complexity and Contradiction. I love what's called the Gentle Manifesto. And it really has a broad application outside of architecture, what my father's talking about. It's a very Eastern philosophy. It's looking at both and instead of either or, black and white, and sometimes gray instead of black or white. This is the definition of non-dualism in Eastern philosophy. And that idea of creating a balance through the difficult whole. He talked about the easy unity of exclusion versus the difficult unity of inclusion. And I think that's very, very important as a concept, and it takes a lot of talent to be able to do that. So when you open up the Pandora's box by getting rid of previous sets of rules that modernism dictated, these rules are sort of guardrails. And if you don't know what you're doing and don't really have masterfulness, you can create a lot of bad architecture. And I think that a lot of bad architecture came out of the removal of those rules that I think my parents, my father specifically, was not a fan of. And It's kind of ironic. But not really, because it was about the idea of being masterful and not being a rule follower.
So how did he know at the time that he was being masterful versus just going off on some tangent?
Don't know if he thought of it that way. I think he was just trying to be good. One of my favorite works is inside Complexity and Contradiction is the Gentle Manifesto, which is a page in the beginning. And the third paragraph begins, "Architects can no longer afford to be intimidated by the puritanically moral language of orthodox modern architecture. I like elements which are hybrid rather than pure, compromising rather than clean, distorted rather than straightforward, ambiguous rather than articulated, perverse as well as impersonal, boring as well as interesting, conventional rather than designed, accommodating rather than excluding, redundant rather than simple, vestigial as well as innovating, inconsistent, equivocal rather than direct and clear. I'm for messy vitality over obvious unity. I include the non sequitur and proclaim the duality. That's just one paragraph. So I think the most important word in that Gentle Manifesto is the word afford. And I think that that gets back to something we were talking about earlier, the floppy drive. We were talking earlier about the 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, and
Yes.
computers no longer have a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk in them, or any floppy disk for that matter. Steve Jobs was the first to get rid of the floppy disk from his original iMac, and it was because of the fact of trade-offs and such. The dogma of modernism, of puritanical modernism at that point in time in the 1960s, actually was in the way of what it was preaching for, which was functionalism. And functionalism became a style rather than a goal, and therefore it was diminishing the function. And at that point in time, symbolism and other factors were important, and the situations had changed technologically, and there was this paradigm shift. There was this situation where there was a need to break free from that dogma, and I think Complex and Contradiction really spoke to many people who also felt similar frustrations, but articulated in a way that was graspable and also profound.
Well, if the point of that departure was about functionalism, as you said, I always perceived modernism to be very functional. In what way was it not?
It depends on what you mean by modernism. In the book, the Seagram's building had I-beams on the exterior. Those I-beams did not serve a function associated with structure. They were applied ornament because the fire regulations wouldn't allow them to be not covered. So there was a pretension about the idea of functionalism at that point in time. They were pretending that it was functional, but it was not functional as such.
I mean, that's one little detail of a giant building. Wasn't the building itself quite functional?
Sure, but you would have situations where architects, for example, would have their building photographed before the client could put a sign on it and mess up the aesthetic.
I see.
The puritanical modern aesthetic that was very much concretizing the fetishization of that. Then all of a sudden, if the client needs a sign to be able to have that, one needs to include that in the list of functions of the building. So the word function can mean an actual ideology that has an aesthetic, even subconsciously and such, but the function includes a commercial element of advertising what the building is. And therefore that needs to be integrated. And yet, if we look about capital M modern, one wouldn't think a kind of, let's say, a Las Vegas looking sign or any sign was integrated into that modern building, because it became a stylistic trend rather than a functional trend. So it became a kind of religion rather than a practical thing. And if you were getting against that religion by studying history or looking at other things, you were often excommunicated from the church. We have many examples that we've heard about that of people at places like Harvard, where if you looked at history or you showed other students history, you were thrown out because of that. And there were lots of examples of that kind of excommunicative behavior on the kind of high priests of modern ideology at that point in time.
Right. I understand about sign versus no sign.
Yeah.
But there's got to be something more than that in terms of the actual building's design. So how did your parents depart from traditional modernism in that way?
So one of the things that it helped me in making this film was gathering the archival material. Michael Blackwood produced some fantastic films, two of them that included my parents primarily. Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in the late 80s, and Beyond Utopia, which included them among, I think, 4 other architects. A very good film. But another film that was done was on Mies van der Rohe. There's a clip of my father speaking about that. He said many things in his life, and he would take back very few. This is the middle 1980s.
Okay.
Except maybe one, which was less is a bore. which is he most famous for.
Yes.
And it's because he was attacking Mies, not as Mies, but in the context of everybody being obsessed with that and concretizing what Mies's words were. And I didn't really understand their work until I saw that Mies documentary. And the idea that form accommodates a changing variety of functions was what Mies talked about in that documentary. My parents talked about the mitten versus a glove, the idea of a non-articulated form, a generic loft building. I didn't understand how important that was to Mies. And form needing to accommodate a variety of changing functions over time, not just the first owner, but multiple owners. And I think my parents embraced that at a time when others had ignored that portion of it. And so where they departed, I think, from my father's words about it, is the idea of symbolism in architecture. The idea that the vocabulary of modernism, I mentioned the I-beams, was around the Industrial Revolution because that the style of modernism developed around that period of time, capital M modernism, and therefore the functionalism around that was around the industrial vernacular. And I think that projects like the National Collegiate Football Hall of Fame and others were looking for an updated sense of symbolism that went beyond the Industrial Revolution to the age that we were in then, the electronics age, the information age, and those kinds of things, because abstract expressionism, to a certain extent, was devoid of meaning. So symbolism that related to the culture was part of the function of the building, part of the cultural context, the way classical architecture embraced that. These buildings also learned from buildings in Venice because they had been around for centuries. And why had they been around for centuries? Well, you go back to that idea that they're generic loft buildings, and therefore they could adapt. And their ornament was what they called a decorated shed. The structure of the building was based on the function rather than what my mother called a duck, which is a building whose, based on the Long Island duckling, whose symbolism was based on the structure of the building.
Okay.
And so that a lot of architecture that is trying to say something is a duck, and ducks are less functional. And also, in so much as there needs to be change, then it's more likely that you tear that down. And therefore, environmentally speaking, a duck is less green than a so-called decorated shed in that way.
I don't pretend to understand most of what you just said, but let me try. So would that apply, let's say I have a donut shop.
Yeah.
And I shape the building like a donut.
Yeah.
Is that a duck?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's many examples. A cathedral's a duck.
Okay.
The function is tied to its shape, and it needs to be a duck because of its function. But in so much as it doesn't need to be a duck, so to speak, or that kind of thing, then it's potentially a mistake because buildings need to be able to live beyond a single owner.
So your parents, in designing a cathedral, would have it look very different than traditional cathedrals.
I think that a very important part of their architecture was context. So I think that the design of any cathedral would fit into the context of the place, and that can be both in a melodic way. Bob talked about a lot, the idea that it fits in because it's similar, but also in a dissonant way. And he would use the example of men's neckties, where you can have something that fits in, but you can also have dissonance to create harmony that comes both from melody and dissonance.
Well, of course. I mean, you're going to customize it to whatever it's around.
Yeah.
But if I'm understanding the principle behind here, you would not make a modern-day cathedral look like a 12th century cathedral. Is that right?
I think the beauty of it is that you can't really say that any of those kinds of things about it. You can't pre-prescribe what it is. The Sainsbury wing to the National Gallery used the same Portland stone as the original building, maintained the cornice heights and the rhythm of the columns, albeit distorted based on the corner, to create a kind of jazz rhythm, and had those kind of classical elements. But it also said, I am a modern building by not having an arch as an entrance, but requiring the use of steel and therefore being honest about that, or the Mesian curtain wall glass, which served a function on the stairway of that building. So it has both modern and classical elements at the same time. And I think that independent thought of looking at each problem fresh in order to be able to create the best solution possible is something that I admire.
Okay. So let's finish up with the Sainsbury wing.
Yeah.
Your parents have been given so many accolades over their careers,
Yeah.
both from U.S. organizations and national organizations. But recently, you had somebody reach out from beyond the grave about the Sainsbury wing. What was that all about?
I heard about it from John Sainsbury when I interviewed him in 2008. Lovely guy. And he told me about the column and how he put the letter in the column.
Yes.
And they were raising money for this project to renovate the building. And, he died after they had proposed it. And I'm presuming he was a donor for it.
Yes, a big donor.
Yeah. And therefore, the idea that they would have discovered it in the construction as if he hadn't told them about it seems to me to be something that I find difficult to understand. And the fact that it made its way as such a good PR story, my understanding is these things don't happen by accident. And I think that there's a lot of things they were trying to deal with associated with the negative PR of the destruction that's happening to the building presently, that they wanted to create some kind of story to counteract that. So I'm very sad about that. I understand why they wanted to distract from the destruction of that building, but I don't find it very funny. I find it very sad, and I also find it, frankly, it smacks of dishonesty.
Dishonesty from whom?
Well, let's just look at the facts. There's no question that he wanted to remove the column.
Right.
He had the letter installed in it. He told everybody about the letter.
Yeah.
And it was represented that they had magically found this letter in the column when they were working on it.
But that was 25-some years ago, right? I mean, he would have told...
He just died.
Okay.
He just died. And he gave money likely for the renovation. I'm not sure about that. And therefore, the idea that somehow it was discovered, it doesn't pass a smell test.
I see. So this is a scheme on the part of the museum to distract from other criticisms.
I can't say what it is. I'm surprised that press outlets that covered it didn't kind of question this.
Okay. But your thought is it's a distraction from something else.
Well, I know what the distraction's from which is that they're going to take away the dark curtain wall glass, which trains the eye to be used to less light as you walk up the stairs into the gallery, which allows the paintings to look brighter. The paintings, when that building was opened, were not cleaned, but everybody said they were cleaned. They looked like they had been cleaned because of the fact that they looked so good. One reason they looked so good was the masterful design of the building that allowed for people to realize that. The other element was the windows inside the gallery that looked out onto the stairway, which were possible because of the diminished light in the stairway. Now, once you remove that darker glass, then you potentially put the paintings at risk from direct light, which means you likely have to put down curtains over, which entombs the galleries and ruins the design of it. So what happens typically is you have a master that understands the whole, and then afterwards you have people who are less educated, and they come in thinking they can improve something by changing a part, not understanding how the parts are interrelated. And so to have an architect that doesn't even have a master's degree in architecture ruin the building that was designed by who I perceive as a master is a crime that's really likely irreversible. And I liken it to Brexit, where there was a lot of lies told in the Brexit referendum. After it happened, you couldn't reverse it, and you're stuck with something that everybody realizes is a mistake.
The film is in the circuit now for documentaries.
Yeah.
Are there plans to have it on streaming somewhere?
Yes. We don't know what those plans are, but we hope to have it on streaming at some point in not too distant future.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for talking with me, Jim. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was George with Jim Venturi. After World War II, architects Matthew and Siasia Nowicki co-authored a plan to rebuild Warsaw, Poland. before they moved to North Carolina. In Raleigh, Matthew became head of architecture at NC State's School of Design under Henry Kamphefner. They worked on Dorton Arena in Raleigh, one of the first hyperbolic paraboloid structures in the world and the inspiration for many stadiums and arenas ever since. Matthew Nowicki died young in a plane crash in Egypt in 1950. He was on his way back from a huge commission in India. After that, Siasia Nowicki began a distinguished teaching career, becoming the first female full professor of architecture at Penn State. George spoke with their son, Peter Nowicki, during last fall's Nowicki Symposium and Exhibition at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Welcome to the show, Peter.
Glad to be here, George.
Your father gets a lot of credit and tribute, but your mother, of course, had a long career in architecture. I didn't know until recently that she worked for a year for Corbusier. That's quite something.
Yes, it is. And you have to place that in the context of her own evolution as a young architect, where she and my father were already doing work together. And this was the Polish Pavilion for I believe it was the 1937 exhibition that was taking place in Paris, 37, 38. The design had already been done, but it was the finishing touches and the construction of the pavilion that was being supervised by the Office of Corbusier, which is why she was there.
And she and your father were really quite the team together.
I think from the very beginning, they had a type of locked in together that is something which was important for her throughout her whole life, even after my father had passed away. So the fact of being married was a way of her contributing to his career, but also a way for him to contribute to her development. So it was very much of a mutual symbiotic relationship.
Now, you were just a few months old when he passed away, but your brother Paul was 9 at that time. What did he share with you about your father?
He was a very loving person, that he felt very close to him. As he once said, he participated in my father's work just by being good at the right time.
Ah, so well-behaved boy?
Well-behaved when it mattered, when it was time to allow my father to work and to finish, and for my mother as well to be involved and not to be totally available. So for a young child, it means having a lot of discipline, which may be more than is normally required.
Your mother taught at the University of Pennsylvania for a long time.
From 1952 to 1977.
And she was one of the first full female professors in architecture in the country.
Yes, and that's not something which she brought home. It was something she did in her work world, but at home she was simply a normal mother trying to make do with all that has to be done and making sure we got to our doctor's appointments and got to school on time and had all the other help that we needed when we came home with bloodied knees, having fallen off of a tree, or doing things that young children would do. So her life with us was very much of a normal life. And the fact that she was a full professor didn't really enter into the equation. I think that is something which her students would have admired much more than I could have ever understood.
Did she also have a practice on the side as well as teaching?
No, I think that after my father passed, she had been totally committed to working with him. And although she did some design work for herself in redesigning the places which we were living at, this design work was not meant to be a professional contribution. It was meant to be something just for herself and for us. So she would have felt much more free about working in this way rather than being part of a professional practice. I think that for her professionally, without my father there was no real point. There was something which they were doing together. When he wasn't there, she'd lost the desire to be in professional practice.
And she never remarried?
No, and I think that that is something which one can understand in the sense that sometimes your bond with somebody is so close that afterwards no one else can really fill the space that's left.
Yes. She lived a long time. What was it, 104, 105?
I almost made it to 106.
Wow.
She was a month and a half away from her 106th birthday. So it was a full life. And I think that up to the very end, she was very bright, and she made a point of being able to manage by herself, to find the help that she needed by herself, and to make the choices about where she would live by herself.
I'm sure she was asked, what was her secret for longevity?
I'm not sure that I ever heard the answer to that question. But I think for her, it was just enjoying being alive. And perhaps it was having a small bit of chocolate every day. I think it was simply the joie de vivre.
Okay. Now, how was it growing up with her being a professor? Did architecture influence your life or Paul's life?
I think that my brother always maintained an interest in the building trades. He was a builder himself at one point in his life. He enjoyed also mathematics very much. He had his degree in teaching and taught mathematics. For myself, my feeling was that architecture was about the beauty of the space that you were living in. And for myself, this beauty was translated in the places where we were and in the places where afterwards I chose to be. For instance, when I decided to go to Princeton rather than Harvard, the reason was primarily because Princeton had a beautiful campus, and the sculpture on the campus was something which I really enjoyed. This is something which I think would come from her. In the space that is meant to be enjoyed, the beauty is very important. Tranquility in natural areas, for her made a big difference as well, wherever she lived. Although she was very tempted by New York, which is just the opposite of what I've said. And after her retirement, she went to New York because that was for her a reminder of her youth living in Warsaw, a very cosmopolitan city. And I think that that was also what was part of her DNA. But afterwards, when she became older, she realized that she needed the quiet of the countryside and the beauty of the countryside.
And where did she move then?
She moved to Arizona, to Tucson, where she lived in a desert area with the roadrunners and the other birds that were there. And then after that, she came to live with us for a while in Lille in northern France. Then she went back to the States, and I have a hard time putting all the pieces together. But that was when she discovered the last site, which she actually built herself in Norwich, Vermont. Beautiful by its attention to the local vernacular. And she had her garage was designed as a small red barn, and the rest of the house was centered and looking over a river that was flowing past the house. And that river was the center of her attention. If I go back to where I grew up in Villanova, Pennsylvania, the beauty of that place was the beautiful trees which were surrounding the house, these beautiful American oaks that can grow so big, and there's a big spruce tree as well. So there you could see that her design in both of these houses was to the outdoors, that everything was concentrating. As she redid the Villanova house from being a carriage house, it was oriented toward the outdoors, to the trees, to the beauty of the light that was coming through them. And the same thing in the Norwich house. It was designed from scratch, and there it was really to have a prominent position just next to the river, where all the major living areas were looking out over the river, and where she was confronted by this changing, living body of water, which would sometimes be calm and sometimes be roaring at the end of winter with the water going through. She was fascinated by the beauty of nature, by the scale that you can find in the United States, which is so typical, and perhaps something she didn't know when she was growing up in Poland, although she knew the Tatra Mountains very well, and she also had been skiing quite a bit into the Alps when she was younger.
You participated in September in a Nowicki symposium at North Carolina State University. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that. What was involved in that symposium?
The point that was involved in that symposium was, again, in the same way you are doing now, to have a view of what was it like to live with my parents, who they were as persons, but then also to look at other issues involving the fact of being an immigrant into the United States, leaving behind your own culture, trying to adapt to a new culture, creating a social space for yourself that's fulfilling. In these ways, one can understand that my parents' experience was in one way typical of anyone who was coming into a country, in the same way that I experienced the same thing of going to France. At one point, you decide that a country is your home. And for them, the United States became their home, and they identified with it, and they wanted to become part of it in a dynamic way. This, I think, is something which is perhaps not well understood by persons who have not had the necessity to change or the opportunity to change countries. You have to make a conscious decision to live someplace, and when you do, you don't regret. That decision is very part of your being. And her decision to become part of the United States and its culture was something which she never regretted, and that she tried to participate as she could.
I've always wondered why she didn't stay in Raleigh, because certainly NC State would have welcomed her. She was part of the faculty. Then anyway, why did she go to the University of Pennsylvania?
Question which I can't answer, but I can only give you some feeling that perhaps it was the necessity to have a slight change of venue after the death of my father. And the real answer is that I don't know. When I was growing up, I was not aware of the decision that she had to make in changing from one place to another. And after a while, when I was growing up, it just seemed natural to be where I was. So I never questioned her about the fact that she was making this choice to change.
Sure. But your brother, of course, had grown up in Raleigh for a number of years.
Mm-hmm. And I think that he was very much at home in Raleigh. I don't know how he reacted, except that he had to, like all children do, you simply have to cope with the choices your parents make.
Right. As you talk with different institutions around the world about your parents, what do you see their legacy as? What have they contributed to the overall architecture profession?
It's a beautiful phrase. I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's a phrase by Lewis Mumford, that architecture is a home for man. And I think that my parents were very much concerned that the space that people were living in should be one that sustained them not only in the material needs, but also the social and psychological needs. That the space had to be comfortable, it had to correspond with their social habits, and that it had to be somehow inspiring. I know that the spaces which I lived in, which were, of course, very much marked by the work of my mother, were places where I felt good as a person, but also good in a sense of the aesthetic experience that I was growing up in or that I was living in. Even when I was older, I was always aware of the aesthetic beauty of the environments which my mother was creating in their houses, where she had an active role of design because of redoing them or building them from scratch. There was always this sense of beauty that was extremely important.
Peter, thank you so much for talking with me. It's a real pleasure to have met you during the symposium and learn more about your parents' legacy.
Thank you very much, George. It's been a pleasure for me as well.
That was George with Peter Nowicki.
Sue Ann Kahn is the daughter of legendary architect Lou Kahn, one of the most important architects in history. He was a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania and famous for meticulously built works, provocative unbuilt proposals, and teaching. Kahn was one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, and you can see all his houses at usmodernist.org/lkahn, L-K-A-H-N. In 1974, Kahn died of a heart attack at the time he was designing the Roosevelt Memorial in New York City, which was not built until nearly 40 years later. Sue Ann Kahn has advocated tirelessly for the preservation of her father's work, including an exhibition at the Kimball Art Museum, which Kahn designed, and she is the author of the Louis I. Kahn Notebook. Sue Ann is also an esteemed American flutist, or flautist, if you prefer. She teaches flute at Columbia, and she's past president of the New York Flute Club. And we assume her favorite cereal is, wait for it, Flute Loops. Welcome, Sue Ann.
I should say I was the president of the National Flute Association as well.
Oh, awesome.
Which is the largest association in the world devoted to a single instrument. We have thousands of members. They might not have known that.
I did not. Did you ever get to meet Ian Anderson, the famous rock and roll flautist?
No, I never got to, but he influenced a lot of my flute students.
Yeah.
I had a lot more flute students because of Ian Anderson, I think, in Jethro Tull.
Is he still performing? Do you know?
I have no idea. I'm sorry.
Okay. I remember there was one song, he was really quite virtuoso on the flute. I think it was called The Whistler.
Yeah, it sounds right.
This was mid-'80s, I think, when that was really big. That's the only flute star I know, I'm ashamed to say. Before we talk about your book, let's talk about one of your dad's most unique projects, the music barge. Tell our listeners about that and what's happened to it.
Well, there were two music barges. One that was to go down the Thames River. I think that barge is actually probably not in existence anymore. And the other was a barge commissioned by Robert Boudreau, who started the American Wind Symphony. And the barge was to be built so that he could, well, he started in Pittsburgh, so I guess it was supposed to go down the Mississippi River and then the Delaware River. And the orchestra on it was a wind symphony comprised of students who could join the symphony in the summertime. And the barge was to house the students while they were floating down the river. And then when they would get to a place where they could perform, the barge would open out and have a platform and become a stage. And the wind symphonies would do concerts on it. And it was really quite amazing. I went to see it with my son and my mother in Philadelphia when my son was about 5 or 6. The barge parked in the Delaware River by the Philadelphia waterfront and had a stage and everything. And it was a terrific concert. And people would just flock to the banks of the river and sit there and have a concert. It was a wonderful concept. Robert Boudreau died last month, actually, and the barge was purchased. It's now in North Carolina being refitted, and it's supposedly going to come to rest in the Delaware River as a permanent concert home. I hope that happens.
This lasted a long time, like 40 years, didn't it?
Yeah, and it was partly paid for by the Heinz Company in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
So it was a Pennsylvania thing.
Did you ever get to perform on it yourself?
No, I never did. I auditioned once, but I never joined the band. I can't even remember what happened, but I remember I auditioned once for Robert Boudreau. But I did hear it, and they were a terrific group of young people from all the conservatories in the country. It was a fun project.
Growing up with your father and your mother, Esther, at what point did you realize that your dad was kind of a big deal in architecture?
You know, I thought he was a very big deal when he said he had lunch scheduled with the mayor. I was very impressed with that as a kid.
The mayor of what town?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, okay.
Where we grew up. But my mother always believed in him as a very big deal. And he was just my dad, and he was always great as far as I was concerned. But he didn't really become famous. I mean, the fame that he has now as the most consequential architect of the second half of the 20th century, you could say. It wasn't like that when he was alive.
What was it like?
Well, he struggled. I mean, when he started his profession, it was the recession. It was the 1929. He had years when he couldn't get work. My mother supported the household. And it wasn't until the 50s that he got his first major commissions, the Yale Art Gallery, the medical towers in Philadelphia. He started to be recognized as an architect that did something extraordinary. Buildings that were, in fact, functional could be really beautiful and striking and original. And prior to that, he was really known as an architect's architect. In other words, a teacher, a great teacher of architects, but someone who hadn't built a lot, even though he built a lot of housing projects and smaller houses in Philadelphia. And so his career really took off after the 50s. By the time he died, he was a world figure. He had so much going when he died. The Parliament building in Bangladesh was under construction. The Yale Center for British Art, his second museum there, was under construction. He was still designing parts of the Indian Institute for Management. He had 2 projects in Rabat, Morocco. He had the Demonil Center in Texas. He was all over the map. 2 projects in Jerusalem, and then a new project in Iran, in Tehran, which is featured in the book, which I knew nothing about until I did the research for this book. This was the last project he ever took on. So by the time of his death, if he had lived, I don't know, he would have been capable of so much more. But he was a world figure when he died. But that came rather late in his life.
We've been so used in recent decades to having Iran and Iraq as enemies or frenemies at times with the United States. But before that, Iran and Iraq were very lucrative customers and clients for United States architects. They really wanted to modernize their societies.
That's absolutely true, especially Empress Farah, the Shah's wife. She initiated a world conference of world architects in 1971. And my father went there with Kenzo Tange and a lot of other architects. And that's what led to his commission for this new city. And he had great plans for this. This was an amazing city planning project. And my father was known for his city planning chops. We don't hear a lot about that today. And this would have been an entire city. And he envisaged it as something that would be as permanent and as historic and as built for the ages as the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. In fact, he told an Iranian colleague architect that that's what he was planning, build something as great as that.
Well, certainly a number of his structures have earned that kind of reputation. I know when people go to visit the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, they just come away mesmerized.
The Salk Institute is very interesting because it's a real Beaux-Arts kind of structure with an axis that clearly is straight down the middle. However, like Stonehenge, it links the present with nature, with the sun. And so sunsets at that place, it seems to be the place was meant to contain the sunset. And he oriented all his buildings very closely to the land formation and where they were sited, like Roosevelt Island, being at the tip of the island directly across from the UN and seeming to have a dialogue with the UN building.
What is the origin of the Roosevelt Island project, and why did it take almost 40 years to get done?
Well, it's a long story, as you can see.
Very long,
but,
yes.
If my father hadn't died, it's very possible it just would have been built. But also the city of New York, even in 1974, my father died and the project was complete. However, the city was in very bad financial shape. So once my father was dead, it really was hard pressed to convince New York that they were going to get the money to build it. And it took a long time with a lot of different entities involved to get it built finally in 2012.
I've been to Roosevelt Island and this memorial many times, and it really is quite remarkable, particularly the approach to the monument. There is a set of walkways, and there's a raised level where there's lots of grass, and the amount of stonework in this place is unbelievable. I guess it's granite they put in there?
It's granite, right. It's granite. And when they built it, they were able to access one of the original quarries. He had various samples of granite in his office when he died. And two of the quarries, they weren't quarrying anymore, but this is one of the original quarry samples. So we got it as close as possible to the original color of the stone.
And you walk down this long walkway to the end point, which has this gorgeous view of the river and also of the United Nations complex.
Correct. It's directly across.
And there's what has been referred to as a room. What is that?
The room is the end of the project. He always conceived of the project as a room and a garden. The garden being the approach to the room. And the very first drawings in the notebook that we're referring to in the facsimile are 11 drawings of just the end of the island and a room, which at that point was a very different design than what it ended up being. But the approach, he was toying with the approach in those first drawings. He didn't know whether you were going to go up to the room or down to the room. And in the end, you go up the stairs to go down to the room. And so it's a very interesting kind of approach. And he worked that out later. But he was always, from the minute he saw the site, he was putting that room, the room being the place where you contemplate the four freedoms and you contemplate the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I always felt that the four freedoms were kind of a challenge. They were engraved in stone there, but I felt they were a kind of challenge to the UN. to do their business and see that these four freedoms are carried out throughout the world.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, that's what the UN is supposed to be all about, right?
It's what it's supposed to be all about, yeah.
This is the 50th anniversary of your father's passing, and it's the 20th anniversary of the movie that your half-brother made about him called My Architect, which has gone on really to become one of the most recognized architecture documentaries of all time.
That's true. It's a wonderful film, and the way he photographed the architecture in it is unique. There were many documentaries about my father, but nobody had photography anywhere near what my brother managed to do.
When I interviewed him recently, I let him know this was really like the Star Wars of documentary films. I mean, it set the standard for so many documentaries that came afterwards.
Absolutely true. And he was nominated for an Academy Award for it. I'm very sorry he didn't win. I think he should have.
So I'm holding in my hand Sue Ann's newest book. It's Lou Kahn, The Last Notebook. And you open it up, and there's two pieces, two booklets actually. The first is a series of notes and photographs and description of The Last Notebook. And then you open up the other one, and I opened up towards the middle when I first got it, and I went, oops, well, they forgot to print this one. But actually, it's a reproduction of The Last Notebook, the actual Last Notebook, which he had completed maybe, I guess, 20 pages of notes in the beginning until he passed away.
Correct.
It just seems like an extremely intimate view into his mind.
It's a very intimate thing. It's an absolute facsimile of the original, except for the fact that the paper in the original is very, very thin, and you cannot have that thin a paper go through an offset printing process. So we had to make the paper just a little bit thicker. However, the size of the book is the same, so there are slightly fewer pages in the facsimile than the original. However, this was never meant to be seen by anybody. It was never meant to be published. It's a very private journal, and he always had something with him that he could write on. Later in his life, and let's say from the 60s on, he favored these Windsor sketchbooks, of which this is one. And I have to say, the publisher, Lars Muller, did a fantastic job of getting exactly the right cover, exactly the right size, the difference between the pencil drawings and the charcoal drawings, and the color that was added. It's all absolutely perfectly original. A number of people who knew my father and picked this up, they felt like they were really just in the room with him. It was such an intimate thing that they had found this book in a drawer somewhere and unearthed it. It's a very private thing. It's his private creation process. It has drawings in it, but it also has notes for lectures that he made. And in a way, he wasn't so much reading from the book as organizing his thoughts in a kind of, they look on the paper like kind of poetry and
Absolutely.
very architecturally laid out.
Can I read some of this?
Sure.
It is good to feel approval out of the unmeasurable of commonality, the aura of human agreement without example. The pyramids seem to say, let me tell of the desire that moderated being and the meeting with nature, in order to be one, can reuse all material as open light. That is quite some poetry there.
I feel very strongly that he talked about similar themes over and over, but he always had a new slant on it. And silence and light, communality, singularity to singularity, the society of rooms, these were all favorite themes of his, but every lecture he gave was different.
What do you think your father's legacy will be decades from now?
It's hard to say. I'm hoping that the way he drew to understand what he was drawing to find out, in other words, he drew constantly from the time he was a little boy, actually, till the time he died. And he was always drawing to understand what was in his mind and understand what was in his heart as a creative process. And we're in a digital age. This is pre-digital material. And I'm hoping that people will take a great deal of inspiration from the drawings and how many of them ultimately ended up as buildings that stood the test of time. And I think he was always hoping that he would build something that would last through the ages, just as the architecture that he revered, like the Baths of Caracalla or the Pantheon or the pyramids or the Valley of the Kings, and these wonderful buildings that he revered and stimulated him to become an architect, that he could join that pantheon of permanent architecture that inspires us. That's what I'm hoping that his legacy will be.
Sue Ann, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate talking with you.
It's been fun.
We'd like to close out with one of your music performances.
Oh.
From the album Mozart Flute Quartets, here's Sue Ann with Alexander Kugel, Errico Sato, and Ronald Carbone with Quartet in D. Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger. And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Palm Springs, Malibu, Los Angeles, and Toronto. Okay, Tom?
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Motivated is her middle name. Or it could be Maud. We really don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another inspired edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.